The UN Climate Change Conference is the largest gathering for climate action in the world. The first week of COP27 ongoing in Egypt kicked off with the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit, attended by over 120 world leaders who came together to discuss their wishes and concerns in the fight against climate change. At the start of the Implementation Summit, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated that humanity is on its way to climate hell.
And the clock is ticking. We are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell, with our foot still on the accelerator.
The geopolitical context which COP27 is taking place against the backdrop of this year is a fragile one. The global food and energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and growing US-China tensions have pushed climate change down the political agenda for several countries. This is as the effects of climate change continue to intensify. Leaders from developing and emerging economies urged rich nations who are most responsible for the climate crisis to deliver on promises.
We know what it is to put a man on the moon, and now we're putting rover on Mars. We know what it is. But the simple political will that is necessary, not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve, seems still not to be capable of being produced.
Africa contributes less than 3% of the pollution responsible for climate change, but is most severely impacted by the ensuing crisis. Africa, and it is therefore only fair and proper that this conference takes necessary measures to recognize Africa's special needs and circumstances.
Funding for loss and damage from developed wealthy nations whose historic and current activities have largely contributed to the climate crisis is on the agenda at COP27 for the first time. And although it's not on the official agenda, discussions on gas are ongoing at COP this year, as Europe seeks fresh supplies in the wake of tensions with Russia, and African leaders and negotiators argue that the continent should be allowed to use gas, a cleaner fossil fuel, to support its energy transition. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz warned against a fossil fuel renaissance.
We will move away from fossil fuels, no ifs, ands, or buts. There must be no worldwide renaissance in fossil energies. And speaking for Germany, I say this: it will not happen.
On climate finance, speaking to activists on the sidelines of COP, French President Emmanuel Macron said non-European rich nations like China and the US need to pay their fair share.
We need the United States and China to really be on board. If I were to simplify things on emissions, our battle is for the richest to be present, to pay their fair share, and on this point, let's be clear, I need us to say things: the Europeans pay, but we are the only ones to pay.
Arriving at the conference late, US President Joe Biden apologized for the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement in 2020.
The climate crisis is about human security, economic security, environmental security, national security, and the very life of the planet.
And US climate envoy John Kerry addressed global leaders, stating that the US is working as hard as it can to deliver President Biden's pledge to provide $11.4 billion a year by 2024 to help developing countries to green their economies.
Our administration is working as hard as we can to deliver on President Biden's pledge to quadruple climate support by 2024. And we are absolutely committed to doing our part. But even as we do that, I know that's not enough money.
His speech was interrupted by a climate activist who accused him of promoting false solutions.
This is what I was talking about.
Campaigners are known to hold demonstrations at annual COP events. This year, there are fewer demonstrations because of a crackdown on protests and dissent in Egypt, but protesters have still gathered outside the venue, even K-pop fans. The first week of COP27 saw South Africa sign a loan agreement with Germany and France for the two European nations to extend €300 million each in concessional financing to Africa's largest polluter. Climate finance is an important aspect of addressing the global climate crisis. However, there are concerns about the path to net zero, creating more debt for developing countries and emerging economies.
At the end of this session,
To accelerate climate finance and investment in green infrastructure in Africa, the African Development Bank, the AU and partners launched the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. The Africa Carbon Markets Initiative was also inaugurated this week, aiming to establish carbon credits as one of Africa's top export commodities by 2050. And the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda was announced to enhance resilience for 4 billion people living in the most climate-vulnerable communities by 2030.
This agenda is a comprehensive, shared agenda to rally global action around 30 outcomes that are needed to address the adaptation gap and achieve a resilient world by 2030. The agenda aims at accelerating transformative action by countries, regions, cities, businesses, investors, and civil society to adapt to the acute climate hazards facing vulnerable communities.
Other agreements reached this week include the signing of an MOU between Israel, Jordan, and the UAE to develop a 600-megawatt solar photovoltaic, and governments representing over half of global GDP announced a plan to accelerate decarbonization of 5 major sectors. On the race to net zero, Chinese envoy Xi Zhenhua has stated that China is ahead of many developed countries in transitioning to renewable energies.
China's renewable energy reached 1.12 billion kWh by the end of last year. What does that mean? It means the combined installed capacity of renewable energy in many developed countries is less than that of China.
He also used the opportunity to reaffirm that the US-China climate accord is suspended.
When our cooperation was going very well, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives visited Taiwan. She violated China's sovereignty and hurt the feelings of Chinese people, violated the spirit of the 3 China-US joint communiques. So we announced the suspension of climate change cooperation with the United States. But who should be blamed for this? It is the United States.
Negotiations, discussions, and demonstrations will continue throughout the second and final week of COP. Thematic days on gender, water, energy, and biodiversity will also hold. There's been some progress, but the pledge of $100 billion in annual climate finance to developing countries has never been met. And there's no clear plan yet on doubling finance for adaptation by 2025. Just how much will be achieved remains to be seen. Leila Johnson Salami, Arise News.
Leila, thank you so much for that report. And of course, that sets the tone for our next conversation. Because right now, let's bring in environmental expert speaking about Kayode Olaniyan to speak more on the implications of climate change on the attainment of sustainable development goals. Kayode, thank you so much for being here. And of course, we know COP27 is on the way there in Egypt. But I want us to look inward here in Nigeria. This year, we've seen, food crisis alarms being issued on Nigeria due to, of course, insecurity and, of course, impacts of climate change with all the floodings and the likes. Would you say Nigeria as a nation were doing enough, really, to avert this food crisis?
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me. To answer your question correctly, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of getting the right results as regards flooding, climate change, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. Right now, from the reports that we've received, there are quite a lot of people that have been impacted by flooding, and that's also affected food security, and it's going to get a little bit worse next year because a lot of the food has been destroyed. But I think what we need to start doing is start looking at how we can leverage technology in order to be able to achieve the SDGs. So for example, if we look inwards and how we can use technology to be able to achieve some of the goals relating to food security, for example, the first goal, no poverty, and also hunger, right? So if we start to look at precision farming or precision agriculture, we can then start to look at what the weather forecasts are like and how we can also create more food for people around us.
Yeah, Olaniyan, yeah, very well said. But some environmentalists and other analysts looking at Africa with just 3% of the emissions, generated in the world that has led to these climatic changes, some are saying that there isn't so much agreement on the realization of, the problem of global warming and emissions. They say where there is, a kind of disagreement is the solution trajectory. And isn't that what we've been saying from the Paris, resolution on climate change to COP26 in Scotland and today in Egypt, COP27? I don't know if Olaniyan heard me there. Are you with us?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I asked the question. My question is straightforward, that Africa emits just 3% of global emissions that leads to, the various environmental hazards or the climate change, as is put in context. And some environmentalists and other analysts say, look, the issue here, the disagreement about the issues of climatology is not so much as what is happening, but a solution trajectory. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. The major problem that we also have is that we try to use some of the solutions that have worked abroad. And I think it's right time for us to start to domesticate some of those solutions and retrofit them in the decarbonization of our country, right? And I say this because people have already started imbibing pro-environmental behavior and reducing their emissions by installing solar panels, for example, and using renewable energy solutions, right? And of course, all of these solutions cost a lot more than the traditional oil and gas. And it's important that companies and even people start to look inwards on how we can reduce our emission and reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases so that we can attain the limits.
Nigeria. Okay.
Well, at the end of the day, let's not forget, as it stands right now, climate change has been highlighted as one of the major factors that are actually responsible for the issues bedeviling Nigeria when you look at the issue of flooding, heat wave, and the likes. And let's not forget that President Muhammadu Buhari, then at the younger, that's the United Nations General Assembly, he had actually laid out an ambitious yet essential plan to tackle climate change. Do you think it's achievable, looking at the major highlights from what the president is actually proffering as a solution, not just to Nigeria, but developing nations? Well, I don't know if you can hear me. Well, I did ask you a question about an ambitious plan by President Muhammadu Buhari, especially looking at when he was at the United Nations General Assembly in terms of tackling climate change here in Nigeria, which some would say is part of the reasons why we're seeing the high level of poverty in the country. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yes. So, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, to be able to achieve those national designated agreements and those numbers, it's important that we start to look inwards as well. You know, we can go out to COP27 and make XYZ sort of limits, right? And also promise some numbers, but what are we doing internally in order to be able to achieve those SDGs and also reduce flooding and also reduce incidents of climate change in terms of adaptation, resilience?
Olaniyan, some again, you know, coming from African environmentalists and particularly from the developing world, they are saying that if this climate revolution, for example, does not, or if it doesn't have a solution that works for developing economies to expunge the issues of poverty, human development, and unemployment, and economic growth, it should be done away with. Will that help environmentally, particularly the African environmental renaissance?
We can't not get involved. We have to come back to the table. We have to collaborate. And one of the, if you look at Goal 17, is actually partnership for the goals. So everybody needs to come together and collaborate. Look, it's not really about who is going to pay for the damage. It's about finding a better and innovative way to find solutions to some of these problems. And I personally think that it's important that we leverage technology to be able to achieve some of these limits. For example, we've seen that if we innovate better and build better, we can find out when rainfalls are high. We can do better forecasting in terms of leveraging technology to be able to achieve those. And also, we find that if we think rationally, most of the root cause of our security problems actually emanated from a climate-related or an environmental degradation problem. So, for example, if you look at what has happened in the Niger Delta region, for example, there's been a lot of oil spill, and that has emanated and caused us a lot of militancy and security problems. Similarly, for the herdsmen issue, it was actually desertification because the Lake Chad has reduced and shrunk significantly by about 90% from 1963 till date. And all of this is because of our activities, both in the developed world and also in emerging economies. We found that most of the problems that we have is not going to even emanate from the country, for example. So if you're emitting somewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's that part of the country that will be affected by the activities. So you find in the manufacturing field, for example, we have something we call STAC, which emanates from air dispersion modeling. Now, when you look at the STAC and the prevailing wind condition, it's possible that you're actually having an activity in Lagos and the effect is going to be felt outside of the country because it's just one space. Right? So we need to come back together and find a better way to collaborate in order to be able to fix the problem, as opposed to saying, oh, we are not going to get involved or XYZ is going to pay. Yes, some people are going to pay for some of these damages. And of course, we have companies that are starting to look inwards and reduce their emission by having renewable energy technology, for example, and also recycling their waste as at when due.
All right.
Well, the solution we have to look inwards is what you're proffering, but of course we need to do more as a people generally, so that way the devastation as experienced this year will not happen again. And of course we look forward to more resolutions as it affects Africa in COP27. We have to say thank you so much. That's Kayode Olaniyan there, an environmentalist from our Lagos studio.